Since the beginning of its recorded history, North China has always been an area where land and weather make inhabiting and producing from the land difficult. Problems included rivers that changed course quickly and flooded easily, coupled with weather that could lead to widespread drought in the same year, a large insect population, natural disasters such as earthquakes, and widespread disease. North China wasn't always this way, but rather changed over centuries due to human settlement, agricultural land use, and urbanization. Over this time, the Han River Basin changed to form an environment that led to irregular crop production each year with some total harvest failures leading to the widespread famine and food shortages that are still seen today. This gradual environmental transformation began with the removal of trees to make way for farmland. And as we learned in the class, distinct groups of Chinese and non-Chinese formed to all influence the development of China, but the Chinese were the most successful and known as the Han Chinese. Land was seized from people who were already there and altered to fit into the Chinese way of life, which was family farming and paying taxes to a central state. The Chinese interacted with the Mongols, who had a very different way of life, which in turn shaped the further development of China. Since the beginning of China's famine problems, there have been responses on state, individual, and government levels, which would produce short-term benefits with long-term consequences. Some examples were controlling the rivers, which could lead to more reliable farming and crop production for a year, but also lead to flooding years down the line from the silting of the rivers, and the dense population of northern China meant that there would be more people affected by natural disasters such as floods, droughts, and famine. Qing emperors devoted huge amount of attention and effort into managing rivers in Jifu, the capital region. This decreased over time as we approach more and more modern times. It got to the point where there was even a rain cycle and river management. This basically meant that at the beginning of each new ruler of China's time, there would be a large flood somewhere at the beginning of their ruling, and their response to this would be used by the emperor to show how much he cared about his people. From the end of the 17th century to the end of the 20th century, Zili's population climbed from 10 to 90 million people. This huge increase in population and shifting of the use of land from a semi-pastoral economy in the 18th century to an agricultural economy in the 19th century led to widespread famine and poverty by the 20th century. Agriculture in North China was mainly based on multiple grain crops that were adaptable enough to grow in the poor soil conditions and the irregular climate. One of the most important crops was grain, and this remains one of the most important crops throughout much of the early history of northern China. Rice was also grown and produced, but it wasn't as economically important. Beans were grown to feed people and animals, and as the population continued to grow, corn, potatoes, fruits, and vegetables became important, with cotton quickly becoming a cash crop. This diversity of crops also meant there could be dual growing seasons, or a crop cycle in the winter and summer, which was vital for economic stability. Historians found prices of grain and living conditions to be closely linked to the point where they can predict famine mortality rates just by looking at grain prices at the time. Price inflation also became a problem as the population continued to increase. Beijing was the Qing capital, centered in the Shili province. Its population was 1 million by the 18th century, which led to residents relying on regional and local sources for food. One of the main sources for famine relief were soup kitchens. Soup kitchens operated in Beijing every winter and were used for emergency relief in the 19th century. They were regulated by a board of revenue and initially started out as 10 soup kitchens. Soup kitchens were also used for relief in harvest crises. These soup kitchens, however, also attracted famine refugees. The government responded by expanding soup kitchen hours and operating them during spring. In 1813, grain was given directly to shops for reduced price sales to further stimulate the economy. Families were allowed to collect 5 days' rations at once to avoid repeat trips. Eventually, soup kitchens morphed into more charitable organizations in later history. In the early history of China, it was seen as one of the ruler's obligations to encourage grain storage through concepts such as river control and granaries. Storing grain was seen as extremely important for dealing with the inevitability of famines. Green sprout loans were established, which extended credit to peasants during the late winter and spring periods to be repaid after their fall harvest. Local elites were often trusted with the responsibility of storing grain, and the first Ming emperor declared that 4 granaries should be set up in each country, which never played out fully. Granaries became community-oriented and for emergency relief primarily. These large reserves of grain allowed the state to work on other issues to provide economic security and political stability through social welfare, including famine relief, price stabilization, and land management to reduce impact from seasonal weather changes. Another recurring method for dealing with famine was dazan, or general relief. They were prescribed regulations that were existing throughout the winter. They were extended under special circumstances and were specific to each household based on income. The main purpose of general relief was not social welfare, but mainly agricultural assistance. The multi-crop system was a mixture of spring and fall crops that made it possible for a harvest shortfall in one season to be followed by a better one the next season. Later in the history of China, the government began to pay for the cost of freight to take advantage of faraway grain markets and bring it back for relief. Railways began to limit the loss of life in harvest crisis seasons and were very important. Markets in North China developed very unevenly. Transportation through Center Zili was becoming more complicated, while at the same time their trade with areas outside the Great Wall was dramatically increasing. Only political disruptions in the 20th century involving Russia and Japan reduced trade with the Manchurian region. States played a huge role in promoting economic stability during the Han Qing dynasty by supplying huge amounts of grain to Beijing and Zili, which kept prices stable through grain storage and famine relief. This didn't lead to long-term economic change, however, until the introduction of rail systems and improvements in irrigation and water storage. During the Han Qing period, grain reserves were still just as important in preventing harvest failure, but their main purpose was to provide famine relief and allow the population to rebuild afterwards. Han Qing's state-mounted large-scale relief made use of these grain stocks to maintain social order. An example of this state relief included famine investigations, where it was required to report any harvest crisis within a certain amount of time. This would be followed by a survey of conditions by the Board of Revenue, finally ending with a classification of needs. After this was done, general relief, or dazan, could be decided on and distributed. The 19th century was the century where the dynasties of China began to decline and started to move toward what we now know as modern China. This period in northern China's history also faced an enormous number of natural disasters. In 1801, the Hai River Basin flood affected every country in the Zili province, sweeping away crops and people and crippling the area. From 1813 to 1814, Zili went through the most severe drought in their recent history, with a rainfall at a 55% reduction from the average, which led to political unrest, population movement, and inflation. From 1871 to 1872, they suffered more floods and droughts, which blended together to create an almost constant crisis. This paled in comparison to the Great Drought Famine, though, from 1876 to 1879. This was one of the worst disasters in Chinese history, which killed between 9.5 and 13 million people. This also led to large-scale spread of illness, breakup of families and population movement, cannibalism, and a huge increase in crime. There was more flooding between 1890 and 1895, but this was different than before, as the famine relief efforts were not on nearly as large of a scale, which led to an environmental decay and increasing social disorder. North China was by far the most affected area of China, and the Zili province experienced the highest rate of natural disasters in 19th century China's history. Skipping forward to more recent history, by the end of the 20th century, the increasing prosperity for the population of China significantly reduced famine problems to the point where they are much closer to problems of overindulgence rather than the famine and hunger problems of its history. The older populations will remember the famines of the Great Leap Forward, while a large amount of the younger population won't have any idea of the severity of previous food shortages. The reduction in famine and increased ability to secure stable sources of food was seen as a huge accomplishment of the Chinese Communist Party. This, along with increased birth control policies, has led to a far more controlled population with more food to go around in general. The infamous one-child policy was only strongly enforced in the most dire times of food shortages. Still, there are issues with environmental degradation and water shortages, and some of the poorer regions of China still suffer from regular famine and drought. There are still problems with food shortages and famine in China, but compared to past problems in the history of China, the country has made huge strides forward in trying to put an end to these issues.